Zethkalar stood before the massive viewing screen in the Galactic Scientific Consortium headquarters on Valoria Prime. The pale blue light from the display cast shadows across his elongated face as he studied the data streams flowing past. Numbers, charts, and tactical reports filled the screen, all relating to a species the consortium had recently discovered. They called themselves humans. The Valorian scientist adjusted his observation robes and turned his attention to High Researcher Felnath, who was explaining the assignment. Felnath's voice carried the typical emotionless tone that all Valorians used when discussing scientific matters. There was no excitement, no curiosity, just cold analytical interest. The humans have achieved faster-than-light travel approximately 50 of their years ago, Velnath explained, while pointing at various star charts. They have established colonies across 12 star systems and appear to be expanding at a rapid rate. However, they have now encountered the Kreeth Empire. Zethkalar nodded slowly. He knew about the Kreeth. Every species in the galaxy knew about them. They were aggressive, militaristic, and had conquered over 200 worlds in the past 1,000 years. When the Kreeth decided they wanted a planet, they simply took it. Few species had ever successfully resisted them for more than a few months. The Kreeth have declared the human territories to be within their expansion zone, Velnath continued. Initial contact between the two species resulted in immediate hostilities. The Kreeth have begun mobilizing their war fleets toward human space. The display showed massive Kreeth battleships moving through space like dark metal sharks. Their weapons could crack planets in half, and their soldiers were bred for warfare from birth. Zethkalar had observed many species fall to the Kreeth over his long career. It was always the same pattern. First came fear, then desperate resistance, then inevitable surrender when the defenders realized they could not win. "We want you to observe the humans during this conflict," Velnath said. "Your expertise in studying primitive civilizations makes you the ideal candidate for this assignment. We need detailed behavioral analysis of how humans respond to overwhelming military pressure." Zethkalar felt a familiar sense of scientific detachment settle over him. He had spent the last 3 centuries observing various species as they faced extinction, conquest, or natural disasters. It was always educational to see how different cultures handled stress and defeat. Some species fought briefly, then surrendered. Others simply fled their homeworlds. A few chose mass suicide rather than submit to conquest. Each response provided valuable data about evolutionary psychology and survival instincts. "What do we know about human military capabilities?" Zethkalar asked. "Limited, but growing," Velnath replied. "They possess nuclear weapons, basic energy, shields, and primitive faster-than-light drives. Their largest warships are approximately 1/10 the size of Kreeth dreadnoughts. Technologically, they are inferior in every measurable category." The numbers appeared on the screen. Kreeth forces, numbered in the millions with thousands of warships. Human forces numbered in the hundreds of thousands with perhaps 300 combat vessels. The disparity was so vast that Zethkalar wondered if the humans would even attempt to fight. Preliminary observations suggest humans organize themselves into something they call nation-states, Velnath continued. These groups often conflict with each other, so unified resistance against the Kreeth seems unlikely. We expect the usual pattern of internal divisions weakening their response to external threats. Zethkalar studied the tactical displays, showing human colony worlds scattered across space. Each world seemed to have different governments, different military forces, different priorities. It was a typical pattern among younger species. They rarely achieved the unity necessary to face a threat like the Kreeth. "When do I depart?" Zethkalar asked. "Immediately. Your observation vessel has been equipped with the latest cloaking technology. You will position yourself near the primary conflict zone and document everything. Pay special attention to leadership, failures, civilian panic responses, and the timeline of their inevitable surrender." Zethkalar gathered his research equipment and headed toward the docking bay where his ship waited. The vessel was small but sophisticated, designed for long-term observation missions. Its cloaking systems would make it invisible to both human and Kreeth sensors. He could observe the coming conflict without interference from either side. As he prepared for departure, Zethkalar reviewed everything the consortium knew about humans. They were mammals, lived for approximately 80 years, and had evolved from predator species on their homeworld called Earth. Their society showed typical patterns of territorial aggression, resource competition, and tribal loyalty. Nothing suggested they would be significantly different from the dozens of other species he had observed over the centuries. The journey to human space took several weeks. During this time, Zethkalar studied human communications that the consortium had intercepted. Their languages were primitive but functional. Their technology showed creativity but lacked sophistication. Their military doctrines seemed focused on planet-based warfare rather than space combat. Everything confirmed his expectations that this would be another routine observation of a species facing extinction. When he arrived at the edge of human territory, Zethkalar positioned his cloaked vessel near a star system called Kepler 442. Intelligence reports suggested this would be one of the first targets for Kreeth attack. The system contained 3 human colonies with a combined population of 12 million. It was defended by a small fleet commanded by someone called Captain Jake Morrison. Zethkalar activated his recording equipment and settled in to observe. Through his advanced sensors, he could see human ships moving in defensive formations around their colonies. The vessels looked fragile compared to Kreeth warships. Their crews were probably terrified, knowing that death was approaching from the depths of space. On the largest human vessel, a ship they called the Liberty, Captain Morrison was speaking to his crew over their communication system. Zethkalar listened to the translation, expecting to hear desperation or fear in the human's voice. Instead, Morrison sounded calm and determined. "We know what's coming," Morrison said. "The Kreeth Empire thinks they can take our homes, our families, our freedom. They think we'll run or surrender when we see their ships. They're wrong. We're going to show them what humans do when someone threatens the people we love." Zethkalar made notes about the captain's apparent denial of reality. It was common for primitive species to express false confidence before facing superior enemies. The psychology of hope was well documented among species facing extinction. They often convinced themselves they could win impossible battles rather than face the truth of their situation. Soon, Kreeth advance scouts appeared at the edge of the system, dark, predatory ships that moved through space like hunting beasts. They were followed by larger vessels, then massive battleships that dwarfed the human defenders. The invasion had begun. Zethkalar prepared his instruments to record another predictable defeat. The Kreeth fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel like a storm of metal and death. Zethkalar watched through his sensors as hundreds of alien warships took positions throughout the Kepler 442 system. Each Kreeth vessel was massive, bristling, with weapons that could destroy cities with single shots. Their formation was perfect, their movements coordinated with the precision that came from centuries of conquest. Zethkalar expected the human response to follow the usual pattern he had observed in dozens of other species. First would come panic, as the defenders realized the hopelessness of their situation. Then desperate attempts at negotiation or surrender. Finally, the collapse of military discipline as individual survival instincts took over. Instead, something unexpected happened. The human ships moved closer together, forming a defensive line between the Kreeth fleet and the inhabited planets. Captain Morrison's voice crackled across their communication channels, calm and steady despite facing impossible odds. "All ships, hold your positions. Remember, every minute we buy them is another 1,000 civilians who make it to the evacuation ships. We're not here to win this fight. We're here to give our people time to escape." Zethkalar paused in his note-taking. This was not standard behavior. In his experience, military commanders facing superior enemies typically either ordered immediate retreat or attempted to negotiate surrender terms. Morrison was deliberately choosing to engage an enemy that would certainly destroy his entire fleet. The Kreeth commander broadcast a surrender demand in broken human language. "Humans, surrender now. We take planets. You live as slaves. Fight and all die." Morrison's response was immediate. "This is Captain Jake Morrison of the Earth Defense Force. You want our worlds, you'll have to take them, and we're going to make you pay for every inch." The first exchange of weapons fire lit up space with energy beams and explosive warheads. Kreeth ships had shields that absorbed most human attacks, while their return fire carved through human vessels like knives through paper. The battle should have ended in minutes, but the humans kept fighting. When their shields failed, they continued attacking. When their weapons were damaged, they used their ships as rams against Kreeth vessels. Zethkalar watched in confusion as human crews made choices that defied every law of self-preservation he understood. On the human ship called the Defiance, Lieutenant Amy Chen coordinated the defense of a civilian transport convoy. Her destroyer was heavily damaged, leaking atmosphere and losing power. Standard military doctrine would require her to withdraw and preserve her vessel for future battles. Instead, she moved her ship directly into the path of Kreeth fighters attacking the transports. "Bridge to all hands," Chen announced over her ship's communication system. "We've got 8,000 civilians on those transports, including families, with children. Those Kreeth fighters are trying to stop the evacuation. We're not going to let that happen." Her ship exchanged fire with 6 Kreeth fighters. The destroyer's shields collapsed within seconds, and enemy fire began tearing through its hull. Chen could have retreated, saved her ship and crew for another day. Instead, she ordered her pilot to ram the lead Kreeth fighter. The collision destroyed both ships instantly. Chen and her crew of 200 died in the explosion. But the civilian transports escaped while the remaining Kreeth fighters were distracted by the attack. Zethkalar stared at his recordings of the incident. He had never seen anything like it. A military commander had deliberately sacrificed her ship and crew not to achieve tactical victory, but simply to protect strangers she had never met. The decision made no sense from any evolutionary or strategic perspective he could understand. The pattern repeated throughout the battle. Sergeant Ryan Blake led a squad of human soldiers defending an orbital station. When Kreeth boarding parties overwhelmed their positions, Blake ordered his men to fall back while he remained behind to manually detonate the station's reactor. The explosion took out 3 Kreeth ships, but killed Blake and 20 of his soldiers, who stayed to help with the evacuation. Before he died, Blake sent a message to the human command ship. "Tell my wife I kept my promise. The kids made it out safe." Zethkalar discovered that Blake had received orders to evacuate the station an hour before the Kreeth arrived. He had volunteered to stay behind specifically to ensure the civilian evacuation was completed. His wife and children were among the refugees who escaped because of his sacrifice. On another front, human pilots flying small fighter craft were engaging Kreeth bombers heading toward the colonies. The human fighters were faster but much less heavily armed. In any rational engagement, they would use hit-and-run tactics to minimize casualties while inflicting maximum damage on the enemy. Instead, the human pilots were deliberately positioning themselves between the Kreeth bombers and the planet's surface, absorbing fire meant for the colonies below. Pilot after pilot died as they used their small ships to shield the larger transports carrying civilians to safety. "Red Squadron, this is Lieutenant Danny Walsh," came one transmission. "I'm hit bad and going down. Tell my folks I love them, and tell them we got every last civilian off New Boston before the bombing started." Walsh's fighter crashed into a Kreeth bomber, destroying both aircraft. His sacrifice saved a transport ship carrying 3,000 refugees. Zethkalar found himself making increasingly erratic notes. Every behavioral model he understood suggested that these humans should be fleeing or surrendering by now. Instead, they seemed to become more determined as their situation grew more hopeless. They were fighting not to win, but to buy time for people they would never see again to escape to safety. The most disturbing incident occurred when a Kreeth landing ship crashed on one of the colony worlds. The alien soldiers inside were wounded, but still alive. Standard procedure for any military force would be to eliminate the enemy troops or leave them to die. Instead, human medics led by Dr. Lisa Park approached the crash site under a white flag. Park and her team treated the wounded Kreeth soldiers, providing medical care despite being shot at by other Kreeth forces in the area. "They're hurt," Park explained when her commander questioned her decision over the radio. "That's all that matters right now." The Kreeth soldiers she saved later provided intelligence about their fleet's tactical plans, helping the humans organize a more effective defense. But Park had made her decision to help them before knowing they would be useful. She had simply seen wounded beings and chosen to heal them. As the battle continued, Zethkalar realized his scientific detachment was beginning to crack. These humans were displaying behavior that challenged everything he thought he knew about species survival and rational decision-making. They were choosing to help others at the cost of their own lives, not because it served any evolutionary purpose, but simply because they believed it was right. The battle for Kepler 442 lasted 18 hours. When it ended, most of the human defense fleet was destroyed. Captain Morrison's ship was among the last to fall, continuing to broadcast evacuation coordinates until the moment it exploded under Kreeth fire. But the humans had achieved something impossible. They had evacuated over 90% of the civilian population before the Kreeth could capture them. 3 million people escaped because soldiers and pilots had chosen to die protecting strangers. Zethkalar stared at his completed battle analysis, unable to understand what he had witnessed. By every rational measure, the humans had lost. Their fleet was destroyed, their colonies captured, their military forces eliminated. Yet somehow, it felt like he had watched something far more significant than a simple military defeat. He had observed a species that would rather die than abandon their principles, even when abandoning those principles might have saved their lives. For the first time in his long career as a scientific observer, Zethkalar was not sure he understood what he had seen. 3 weeks after the fall of Kepler 442, Zethkalar followed the expanding war front deeper into human territory. The Kreeth Empire was advancing systematically, capturing system after system with overwhelming force. Each battle followed the same pattern he had observed before. Human defenders would fight desperately to buy time for civilian evacuations, then die in hopeless last stands while their people escaped to safer worlds. The Valorian scientist had filled dozens of data files with recordings that his superiors would find deeply troubling. Every engagement showed humans making choices that contradicted basic survival instincts. They consistently prioritized the welfare of others over their own lives, even when those others were complete strangers. But what Zethkalar witnessed in the Proxima system shattered his scientific worldview entirely. The battle had been raging for 6 hours when a human medical vessel appeared at the edge of the combat zone. The ship was painted white with large red crosses on its hull, markings that apparently indicated its peaceful medical mission. Captain Nina Rodriguez commanded the vessel, which the humans called the Mercy Zethkalar, watched in confusion as the medical ship moved directly into the battle zone, broadcasting surrender signals and requests for safe passage. Medical ships were typically evacuated from combat areas before fighting began. No rational commander would bring healing facilities into active warfare. "This is Captain Rodriguez of the medical vessel Mercy," came the transmission on open frequencies. "We are requesting permission to approach wounded vessels from both fleets. We have medical supplies and trauma surgeons standing by." The human fleet commander immediately responded. "Mercy, you are ordered to withdraw to safe distance. This is an active combat zone." Rodriguez's reply stunned Zethkalar. "Negative, command. We have wounded Kreeth and human personnel requiring immediate medical attention. Some of these injuries are not survivable without prompt treatment. We're going in." Zethkalar checked his translation systems, certain he had misunderstood. The human medical ship was volunteering to treat wounded enemy soldiers during active combat. No species he had ever observed showed such behavior. Helping your own wounded made evolutionary sense, but deliberately risking your life to heal enemies served no survival purpose whatsoever. The Mercy moved between the battling fleets, broadcasting medical protocols and requesting temporary ceasefires around damaged vessels. Most remarkably, both human and Kreeth ships began honoring these requests. Even the aggressive Kreeth seemed confused by the sight of humans trying to heal their wounded. Rodriguez and her medical teams boarded damaged Kreeth vessels where alien soldiers lay dying from their injuries. The human doctors worked alongside, their own medics, treating injuries without regard for species or allegiance. When Rodriguez was asked by her own medical staff why they were helping enemy combatants, her answer was simple. "They're hurt. That's all that matters right now." Zethkalar recorded everything. knowing his superiors would demand extensive analysis of this impossible behavior. He watched human medics perform surgery on Kreeth soldiers who had been trying to kill other humans just hours before. The medical teams showed the same dedication to preserving Kreeth lives as they did to saving their own people. Even more incomprehensible was the reaction of the Kreeth soldiers being treated. Several of them tried to refuse medical care, apparently confused by the concept of enemies helping them heal. The human doctors ignored their protests and continued working to save their lives. The situation became even more bizarre when Colonel Steve Murphy received intelligence about a Kreeth bioweapon facility on the captured world of Kepler 442. The weapon was designed to cause slow, agonizing death rather than quick destruction. Murphy assembled a volunteer strike team for what everyone knew would be a suicide mission to destroy the facility. Zeth Kalar expected Murphy to choose the mission for tactical reasons. Destroying enemy weapons always served military purposes. But as he listened to Murphy's briefing, he realized the colonel had different motivations. "This weapon doesn't just kill," Murphy explained to his volunteers. "It causes weeks of suffering before death. The Kreeth plan to use it against our remaining colonies, but they'll also use it against other species they conquer in the future. We can't let that happen." Murphy was not trying to gain military advantage for humanity. He was attempting to prevent suffering for people he would never meet, including future Kreeth victims. The colonel was willing to die to protect strangers from other species who might encounter the bioweapon years in the future. The strike team launched their attack knowing they would not survive. They fought through Kreeth defenses, planted explosives throughout the facility, and died in the resulting explosion. The bioweapon was completely destroyed, along with all research data needed to recreate it. Before the explosion, Murphy sent a final message to Human Command. "Tell my family I did something that mattered. No one else will have to suffer from this thing." Zeth Kalar found himself staring at his recordings for long periods, unable to process what he was seeing. These humans were consistently choosing to help others at enormous personal cost, even when those others were enemies or strangers they would never meet. The most shocking incident occurred during the evacuation of the Vega colony. Private Danny Walsh was assigned to guard captured Kreeth prisoners while human civilians were being evacuated. The Kreeth soldiers had been without food for several days and were clearly suffering from malnutrition. Standard procedure for handling enemy prisoners was to provide minimal care necessary to keep them alive for intelligence purposes. Instead, Walsh began sharing his personal emergency rations with the starving Kreeth soldiers. When his sergeant discovered what Walsh was doing, the young soldier was reprimanded for compromising mission resources. His unit was facing potential food shortages themselves as supply lines were disrupted by the ongoing war. Walsh's response disturbed Zeth Kalar deeply. "They're hungry, Sergeant. Look at them. They're just scared and hungry, same as anyone would be." The private continued sharing his food with enemy prisoners despite knowing his own unit might face starvation if resupply missions failed. He was literally taking food from his own mouth to feed beings who had been trying to kill him days before. When asked why he would risk his own survival for enemy soldiers, Walsh gave an answer that Zeth Kalar recorded but could not understand. "My mom always said you judge a person by how they treat folks who can't help them back. These guys can't help me, but they're still hungry." Zeth Kalar began sending increasingly confused reports back to the Galactic Scientific Consortium. His superiors responded with demands for more objective analysis and warnings about maintaining scientific detachment. They suggested he might be suffering from psychological contamination due to prolonged exposure to primitive emotional responses. But Zeth Kalar could not dismiss what he was observing. These humans possessed something that apparently existed nowhere else in the galaxy. They showed consistent willingness to suffer and die for beings they did not know, would never meet, and who could provide no benefit in return. They called it compassion, but Zeth Kalar had no scientific framework for understanding such behavior. Every species he had studied operated according to predictable patterns of self-interest and group survival. Individuals might sacrifice themselves for family members or tribal allies, but never for random strangers or active enemies. Yet humans seem to consider the welfare of all thinking beings to be their responsibility, regardless of species, relationship, or circumstances. They would risk everything to prevent suffering, even among those who wished them harm. As he compiled his research data, Zethkalar realized he was no longer maintaining proper scientific objectivity. He found himself hoping the humans would find ways to survive their war with the Kreeth. He wanted to see more examples of their impossible kindness. For the first time in his 3-century career as an observer, Zethkalar was emotionally invested in the fate of his research subjects. The realization terrified him, but he could not deny the evidence of his own responses. These humans were changing him in ways he did not understand, and he was no longer sure he wanted to maintain his detachment from their remarkable species. Zethkalar's careful scientific detachment shattered completely when his own survival depended on the very beings he had been studying. It happened during what humans called the Battle of Wolf 359, where a desperate last stand was taking place around a critical supply depot. The Valorian had positioned his cloaked observation vessel near the outer edge of the system, recording another example of human tactical impossibility. 3 human ships were facing a Kreeth battle group of 12 vessels, yet somehow holding their ground through a combination of desperate courage and innovative tactics that defied military logic. Then everything went wrong. A Kreeth hunter-killer squadron pursuing a damaged human corvette detected the energy signature from his cloaking device. Within minutes, Zethkalar found himself facing 3 alien warships that had no reason to show him mercy. His observation vessel was not designed for combat. It had sensors, recording equipment, and life support systems, but no weapons and minimal shielding. When the Kreeth opened fire, his ship's systems began failing immediately. Hull breaches vented atmosphere into space while his power grid overloaded from direct hits. Zethkalar sent an automated distress signal, though he knew no Valorian ships operated anywhere near human space. He would die alone in the void, far from his homeworld, killed by aliens who had no idea what species he belonged to or why he was observing their war. The first rescue ship to respond was human. Lieutenant Commander Grace Kim brought her damaged destroyer alongside Zethkalar's dying vessel, despite the ongoing battle around them. Kim's ship had already lost half its crew and was leaking atmosphere from multiple hull breaches, yet she risked further damage to save a complete stranger from an unknown species. Unknown vessel. This is Commander Kim of the Defender. We're reading life signs aboard your ship. Do you require assistance? Zethkalar's translation systems were failing along with everything else on his ship, but he managed to activate an emergency beacon that transmitted basic mathematical concepts, indicating intelligence in distress. He had no way to communicate his identity, his mission, or his peaceful intentions. Kim's response came immediately. We're coming alongside for emergency rescue. Prepare for boarding. The human rescue team that came aboard his vessel wore environmental suits and carried medical equipment rather than weapons. They found Zethkalar trapped in his damaged observation chamber, slowly suffocating as his life support systems failed. Medic Tony Garcia worked to stabilize the alien's breathing, while engineer Maya Patel tried to determine what atmosphere and pressure his species required. Neither human had ever seen a Valorian before, but they treated his injuries with the same care they would show their own people. Easy there, friend, Garcia said while placing an oxygen mask over Zethkalar's breathing apparatus. We're going to get you out of here. They transferred him to the Defender just as his observation vessel exploded from accumulated damage. Zethkalar found himself aboard a human warship, surrounded by beings he had been studying from a distance for months. Captain Bobby Lee welcomed him to the ship with words that confused the Valorian scientist. We don't know who you are or where you come from, but nobody deserves to die alone in space. You're safe here. Lee asked for nothing in return. No information about Zethkalar's species, no intelligence about alien technology, no explanation for why he had been observing their war. The humans simply accepted his presence and offered him sanctuary because he needed help. Engineer Patel shared her personal food rations with him, apologizing that they did not know his dietary requirements. Medic Garcia checked his injuries twice daily and worked to create medications compatible with his alien physiology. Other crew members offered him spare clothing and a private quarters, despite the ship being overcrowded with refugees from destroyed colonies. For the first time in his life, Zeth Kalar experienced direct kindness from beings who expected nothing in return. The humans treated him not as a research subject or potential threat, but simply as a person who needed help. His scientific objectivity, already damaged by months of observing impossible human behavior, collapsed entirely when Kreeth boarding parties attacked the Defender. The assault came without warning. Kreeth soldiers blasted through the ship's hull and began systematically killing everyone they encountered. Captain Lee ordered all non-combat personnel to secure areas while his remaining crew fought desperately to repel the boarders. Zeth Kalar found himself in the medical bay with wounded humans and the medical staff trying to treat them. When Kreeth soldiers broke through the sealed doors, Petty Officer Chris Young stepped between the aliens and the medical bay. Young was barely 20 years old, a communications technician with no combat training. He carried only a standard sidearm against Kreeth soldiers equipped with heavy weapons and armor. The outcome was never in doubt. "You want to get to the wounded, you go through me," Young announced, raising his weapon. The Kreeth soldiers killed him within seconds, but his sacrifice bought enough time for the medical staff to activate emergency barriers. More importantly, Young had thrown himself on a Kreeth explosive device, absorbing the blast that would have killed everyone in the medical bay. Zeth Kalar watched the young human die to protect people he barely knew, including an alien observer who had contributed nothing to the defense of the ship. Young had no logical reason to sacrifice his life for strangers, yet he did so without hesitation. As Kreeth soldiers prepared to breach the emergency barriers, Zeth Kalar experienced something that Valorians had evolved beyond millennia ago. Tears began flowing down his face as he grieved for a being he had known for less than a week. The emotion was so foreign to his species that he initially thought he was suffering from some kind of medical emergency. Valorians did not weep. They did not form emotional attachments to other beings. They observed, analyzed, and recorded, but they did not care about individual lives beyond their scientific value. Yet here he was, crying for a young human who had died protecting him for no reason, except that it was the right thing to do. The Defender's crew eventually repelled the Kreeth assault, but at terrible cost. Half the ship's personnel were dead, including many who had shown kindness to Zeth Kalar during his brief time aboard. Captain Lee died defending the bridge. Medic Garcia was killed treating wounded crew members under fire. Engineer Patel died, trying to prevent the ship's reactor from overloading. Each death affected Zeth Kalar in ways he could not understand or explain. These humans had become more than research subjects. They had become individuals he cared about, and losing them caused him genuine emotional pain. When the battle ended, the surviving crew held a memorial service for their fallen comrades. They invited Zeth Kalar to participate, though he belonged to a different species and had known the dead for only a few days. "They died protecting all of us," explained the acting captain. "That includes you. You're part of this crew now, whether you plan to be or not." Zeth Kalar found himself speaking at the service, trying to explain what Chris Young's sacrifice had meant to someone from a species that had never understood the concept of dying for strangers. His words were halting and confused, but the human crew listened respectfully as he struggled to process emotions he had never experienced before. After the memorial, Zeth Kalar sent a message to the Galactic Scientific Consortium requesting immediate extraction from the combat zone. He claimed his research was complete, and that continued observation was unnecessary. The truth was that he could no longer maintain scientific objectivity about humans. They had shown him kindness when they had no reason to do so, protected him when it served no purpose, and died defending him, though he was a stranger from an unknown species. He was no longer a detached observer studying primitive behaviors. He had become emotionally invested in the survival and welfare of these remarkable beings, and that investment made continued scientific observation impossible. As he waited for extraction, Zeth Kalar realized that something fundamental had changed within him. He had spent 3 centuries studying other species without forming any emotional connections to them. But these humans had somehow reached past his scientific detachment and made him care about their individual lives and collective fate. He was no longer the same being who had arrived to observe what he expected would be another routine military defeat. The humans had changed him in ways he was still struggling to understand. The war ended in a way that no one in the galaxy had predicted, least of all Zeth Kalar. After 18 months of brutal fighting, the impossible happened. The humans achieved something that contradicted every strategic analysis and military projection. They won, not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through the same incomprehensible behavior that had baffled Zeth Kalar throughout his observation mission. When the Kreeth Empire finally sued for peace, they did so because they could no longer understand or predict human responses to any situation. Zeth Kalar watched the peace negotiations from his extraction ship, still struggling to process what he had witnessed. Admiral Kate Sullivan represented humanity at the talks, facing Kreeth commanders who had expected to be discussing surrender terms for the human species. Instead, Sullivan presented peace proposals that defied every example of post-war negotiations in galactic history. "We're prepared to end hostilities immediately," Sullivan announced to the assembled Kreeth leadership. "In exchange, we want full withdrawal of Kreeth forces from human territory, recognition of our territorial boundaries, and establishment of formal diplomatic relations." The Kreeth war leader responded with confusion. "You demand nothing else? No tribute? No territorial concessions? No slave populations?" Sullivan's answer summarized everything that made humans impossible for other species to understand. "We want you to stop trying to conquer other people. That's all. We don't want to rule you or take your worlds. We just want you to leave everyone else alone." But the truly incomprehensible part came next. Sullivan presented detailed plans for humanitarian aid to help rebuild Kreeth worlds damaged during the fighting. Humans were offering to help repair infrastructure, provide medical supplies, and share agricultural technology with the same species that had been trying to exterminate them for over a year. "Your people are suffering from food shortages and medical crises caused by the war," Sullivan explained. "We can help with that. No strings attached, no political demands. People are hungry and sick, so we help them." The Kreeth delegates stared at her in complete bewilderment. In their entire history of conquest, no defeated enemy had ever offered to help them recover from a war. Most species either demanded revenge or tribute, depending on who had won. None offered charity to former enemies. Zeth Kalar recorded everything, knowing his superiors would demand extensive documentation of these unprecedented negotiations. He watched human diplomats work alongside Kreeth officials to establish refugee assistance programs, medical exchange initiatives, and cultural understanding projects. Dr. Lisa Park, the same human who had treated wounded Kreeth soldiers during the fighting, was appointed to head the medical assistance program. When asked why she wanted to help the people who had tried to kill her, Park gave the same response she had given during the war. "They're hurt. That's all that matters." The Kreeth Empire agreed to the peace terms, not because they were defeated, but because they could not comprehend fighting a species that responded to aggression with offers of help. Human behavior was so far outside their understanding that continued warfare seemed pointless. When Zeth Kalar finally returned to Valorian space, he carried with him video records, data files, and personal observations that would disturb every scientist in the Galactic Scientific Consortium. His report, titled "The Human Paradox, a Species That Thrives by Defying Evolution," challenged every assumption about intelligent behavior and species development. Humans possess characteristics that should have eliminated them through natural selection, he wrote. They consistently prioritize the welfare of others over their own survival, even when those others are strangers or enemies. They show willingness to sacrifice everything for beings they will never meet, with no expectation of reward or recognition. His fellow Valorians read the report with growing alarm. High researcher Velnath summoned Zeth Kalar for extensive debriefing sessions, clearly concerned about what they termed primitive contamination affecting his scientific objectivity. "Your observations show signs of emotional involvement with your research subjects," Velnath explained. "This is highly irregular for a Valorian scientist. We recommend immediate memory modification therapy to restore proper analytical detachment." Zeth Kalar refused the treatment. He had spent months thinking about his experiences with humans, and he was not willing to erase the memories that had changed him so fundamentally. "I observed something that our science cannot explain," he told the review board. Humans have evolved beyond self-interest in ways that should be impossible. They care about the welfare of all thinking beings, regardless of species or relationship. This behavior gives them strength that no other species possesses. The consortium classified his report and recommended that Zethkalar undergo psychological evaluation and treatment. They suggested his extended exposure to human emotional responses had damaged his ability to conduct objective research. Instead, Zethkalar submitted his resignation from the Galactic Scientific Consortium and requested permission to establish an independent research station. He wanted to continue studying humans, not as scientific subjects, but as teachers who might help other species understand the value of compassion. His request was denied. The consortium considered human behavior to be a dangerous anomaly that should be contained rather than studied further. They worried that exposure to human emotional patterns might contaminate other species with similar, irrational behaviors. Zethkalar left Valorian space anyway, using his personal resources to purchase a small observation station near the edge of human territory. He established what he privately called the Compassion Research Institute, though he shared his findings with no one. From his station, he monitored human expansion across the galaxy. He watched them establish colonies that welcomed refugees from other species. He observed their medical ships traveling to worlds affected by disease or natural disasters, offering help to anyone who needed it regardless of politics or ability to pay. Most remarkably, he documented humans forming alliances with former enemies, including several Kreeth worlds that had embraced the human concept of cooperation over conquest. Species that had fought for centuries were learning to work together after exposure to human ideas about mutual aid and shared responsibility. Zethkalar compiled all of this information into research files that would never be published. He had no intention of sharing his discoveries with species that might use the knowledge to exploit human kindness or defend against it. Instead, he maintained his quiet vigil at the edge of human space, no longer a scientist studying subjects, but a guardian watching over the only species in the galaxy that had taught him the meaning of caring about others. His regret was not that he had observed humans at war. His regret was that he could never be like them. Despite everything he had learned, despite all the kindness they had shown him, he remained fundamentally Valorian. He could understand compassion intellectually, but he could not feel it the way humans did. He could observe their remarkable capacity for caring about strangers, but he could not replicate it. He could document their willingness to sacrifice for others, but he could not share their emotional investment in the welfare of all thinking beings. In quiet moments, Zethkalar wondered what his life might have been like if he had been born human instead of Valorian. Would he have possessed their impossible courage, their willingness to help anyone who needed assistance, their ability to see enemies as people deserving of compassion? He would never know. But he could ensure that their remarkable example was preserved and protected. In a galaxy full of species that valued strength over kindness and logic over compassion, humans represented something precious and irreplaceable. They had shown him that the most advanced civilizations might not be those with the best technology or the strongest militaries, but those with the greatest capacity for caring about others. And though he could never be like them, he could spend the rest of his long life making sure they survived to teach that lesson to anyone willing to learn. And his observation mission was complete, but his real work was just beginning.